The dog. The two boys sat on rocks in the dry stream bed that emptied into the wide black mouth of the drainage pipe. The blond boy dug with a stick into the stones and pebbles on the floor of the bed, revealing a greasy, damp layer of fine sand mixed with bits of colored plastic and broken glass. The fertile smell of trapped urine and polluted gutter water rose up from the fresh tear in the hardened surface. Giant reeds of wild grass and bamboo formed a meshed jungle wall on either side of the bleached rocks. Woven into the dense latticework of foliage were dried tumbleweeds, yellowing newspapers, the shredded unraveling pink sweater of a child, a rotted bird carcass crucified in the weeds, a torn and faded tennis shoe, all washed or thrown in toward the drainage ditch from the road above. The road crawled with an unbroken chain of traffic that stretched from horizon to horizon and gushed a low-hanging mixture of dust and opaque black exhaust. The older boy squatted high on his rock like a starved panther. His long, black hair gleamed with sweat, smeared and glued to his purple leather cheeks. He sprinkled an industrial solvent from a can onto a rag and covered his face with it. Sucking the fumes deep into his lungs, he held them in as he stared vacantly into the oily blackness of the pipe, unconsciously fanning his face with his hand to keep the growing cloud of gnats from landing on his tear ducts or lips. He passed the can to the blond boy, stood, and spread his wiry body out into an X across the face of the tunnel, just barely able to grab the upper circumference with his fingers, as his mind spun and drained into the vibrating patterns that formed in the cool blackness before him. As the younger one inhaled the fumes in an exaggerated show of seriousness, like an asthmatic desperate for breath or a diver coming up for air, the older one wailed nasally into the pipe, like a demented foghorn, droning notes that bent from one pitch to another without discernible pattern, echoing with the gradually disappearing springing sound into the abyss. The younger one collapsed backwards among the rocks. His body sprawled out in incongruously wild angles, like an epileptic frozen in mid-seizure, then drugged into a stupor where he lay. He looked up through the permanent curtain of matted and greasy hair that hung across his eyes into the diffusing white sun that seared through the veil of dirt and smog down to his place in the stream bed, engulfing him, then spitting him out, cackling gibberish in a burst of numb and blinding flames. He found himself standing, swaying perilously on a large rock, watching his friend disappear down into the blackness like a long-legged spider sinking into its hole. Following the resonant click of his friend's boot heels and adding to it the responding clicking of his own, he descended into the pipe, guiding himself with one hand along the cold, rigid wall and carrying the rag and can in the other. After just a few feet, the light that sifted in from the entrance was swallowed completely, and the blackness around them was total, snubbing out with its sheer weight any possible memory or connection to the outside world. In regular short intervals, they stopped and squatted side by side against the curved metal walls, passing the rag and can back and forth. The blackness writhed with hallucinated creatures and phosphorescent rushes of color, swirling and lacing through the enclosed, snaking void that ran beneath the endless industrial complexes and the chaos and dust of the ruined city. After a half hour of descending mindlessly, they came to a joint in the tunnel where another pipe led off emptily to the right at a steep upward angle. They felt it pumping dense, hot air down into the main tunnel. At first, they explored this new blackness, but the increasing steepness of the incline and the growing presence of a noxious odor, a mixture of burning plastic, viciously stinging chemicals, and organic human or animal waste, augmented their fear of losing their way, and they inched backward to their original course. Soon after, as they slowly spiraled down, randomly howling and shouting echoes into the dead silence, they heard a distant low rumble building behind them. As it increased in intensity to a roar, the older one barked at the younger one to jump onto his back and hold on. Spread out like a single creature, the younger one clinging like a blind infant sloth to its mother's back, the older one pressed out with all his strength against the metal spiral. They screamed but heard nothing as the torrent of filth engulfed them up to their necks. A rage of liquid chemicals, mixed with blood and offal, rushed with impossible force against their backs, trying to pull them under. Small chunks of tin, metal shavings, soft clumps of fecal matter, and once the ensnarling full length of a cow's intestines washed over them, the regular overflow of waste from the factories and slaughterhouses above. When the onslaught subsided, they collapsed laughing on the freshly slickened surface of the curved walls. The younger one discovered he'd held on to the can of magic fluid like a peasant holding up a crucifix standing before a firing squad. They shared the last of the fumes and threw the can back, ricocheting into the blackness. They went on staggering and sloshing in the mush that now filled their boots. Sometimes the older one screamed suddenly at the dark in short, dry-throated bursts, like a tormented psychotic tortured in his straitjacket. The younger one inserted his grimy black fingers into his mouth and whistled a shrill response into the reverberating depths. He blankly imagined he was being led down into hell, a place where the darkness would fill his greedy lungs with a thick river of ebony scum. He felt no fear or any other emotion as he proceeded, apart from the sense of poison euphoria that came with inhaling the vapor, and his submerged total helplessness, immersed in the narcotic hallucinations that grew in the buried absolute absence of light in their tunnel beneath the city. Gradually, a fog of ochre light could be seen filtering into the darkness around a curve ahead of them in the tunnel. They felt their pupils shrinking in their eyes as they approached the grated metal gate that guarded the mouth of the pipe. Dripping green clumps of matter too large to pass through the grill clung loosely to the steel webbing like toxic carnal vines in a subterranean jungle infused with fresh light. Each boy saw the other was coated up to his neck in a thick brown shell of slime, like a soft scab grown out of a parody of body armor. Bits of fiber, cigarette butts, clumps of hair, and fly larvae clung to the stiffening muck. They squeezed through the sides of the gate, scraping off some of the black mud in the process. Yelping like savages, they leapt out into the sun and rolled down the white sandy banks that descended on either side of the putrid stream that regularly spilled from the pipe and blackened sand and rocks in its path, with a coat of slime before engorging the sea. The incoming waves rolled silently in the thick black water of the deserted cove, depositing back on the shore the indigestible litter that had flowed into it along with the sludge. Scattered piles of granulated styrofoam, knotted mounds of horsehair fiber, a cluster of oversized veterinary syringes, some broken and some still half full of blood, various small plastic molds used in manufacturing machine fittings, a torn Polaroid of an obese naked woman splayed obscenely on a frilly bed as she mock-leered up at her husband behind the camera, discarded rubber sandals, a tangle of cheap glow-in-the-dark child's bracelets, and innumerable other objects too buoyant to be sucked under in the spreading quicksand of waste beneath the water. The debris was deposited along the beach in ghost patterns of the waves as they retreated with the tide back from the rocks and sand that fed out from the base of the cliffs that enclosed the cove. Balancing and slipping from rock to rock, they made their way along the shore. When they came to a deep pool of trapped rainwater, they jumped in and rinsed the scum from their clothes. Sitting on a rock, drying out in the sun, the older one took a still-sealed baggie of brightly colored pills from his jeans pocket and emptied a handful for himself and the younger boy. They found a smaller, clean pool of water and washed down the assortment of amphetamines, synthetic hallucinogens, and barbiturates with tepid water drunk from their hands. As they lay back among the rocks watching the smoke shifting above them, sealing the sky closed, they listened to the seamless folding of the viscous waves, barely audible beneath the rumbling and groaning of the trucks convoying along the road that abutted the cliff edges up behind them. The truck shook the earth down through the cliffs to the beach, migrating along the road like a thundering diaspora of stricken prehistoric beasts, roaring their agony up at the sinking sky. As the sun traveled behind the ceiling of smoke and tarnished clouds, the shadows projected on the underside became the drugged anthropomorphisms and apparitions of their chemical dreams. The older boy lay curled on his side, baking in the sun like a discarded and emaciated fetus for the dead, in the rocks by its wandering, mutant giant mother, as she'd scavenged among the washed-up trash of the ruined city. His eyes rolled sightlessly in his head as sandflies worked at the gummed saliva in the corner of his lips. His fingers were bunched in against his chest and twitched as if typing out a frantic description of his dementia. The younger boy strayed along the thin, hard strip of sand between the water and the rocks, oblivious to the punctures and gashes in the numbed flesh of his feet, made by the broken glass and shards of metal embedded in the sand. Out in the stewing black water, just past the line of lethargic waves, a mass of churning, shredded flesh drifted southward with the current. Ahead of him up the beach, he saw a dark pile, shaking as if alive. As he came near, he saw it was a large mongrel dog, panting maniacally in quick, steady rhythms. One of its rear legs had been torn away, probably by a truck, and it had been rolled down the side of the cliff and dragged itself through the rocks onto the beach. A murder of crows watched it from the dried branches of a tree at the base of the cliffs. Without moving its head, the dog looked up at the boy, smiling, its tongue hanging loose from its mouth onto the sand, culminating in a billowing pile of foam. The sandflies danced in shifting herds from its eyes to its mouth, to the pile of foam, to the open wound, to the expanding pool of blood. 3 hand-sized crabs gripped the wound, eating the exposed meat. The boy found a stick in the rocks and flicked the crabs away. Pressing the stick into the wound, he twisted it until the dog shrieked its last breath of pain, drowned out by the sudden cacophony of crows, echoing like the schoolyard cries of excited children against the walls of the cliffs.